Good morning. Before I get started, I want to say a quick thank you to Bob Prechter and the Socionomics Institute, and in particular Dave Allman for inviting me out today. As Ewan said, I teach personal finance to high school seniors, and every year, the very first thing I do, the very first day of class, is I tell them a story. And it's the story of Man Gulch, so I thought I'd share it with you today because it frames my whole class. In 1949, 15 firefighters jumped out of an airplane and into Man Gulch in Montana to fight a small forest fire. Once on the ground, however, conditions changed for the worse, and within 2 short hours of landing, most of the men would be dead. In his book, Young Men and Fire, author Norman MacLean explores what went wrong, and he found some interesting things. When the men had landed, the fire had indeed been small, but then the winds shifted, fueling the fire and pushing it rapidly up gulch towards the men. The men then found themselves trapped on about a 75% incline, and that incline was covered in waist-high, dry, tinder-like grass. Their foreman, Wag Dodge, was the first to recognize that they were in serious trouble. He was by far the most experienced man on the ground, and he immediately ordered his men to drop their heavy equipment and make a run for the ridge. But the men, being far less experienced than Dodge, couldn't see that things had changed, so they hesitated. Many of them actually refused to drop their heavy equipment. By the time they recognized that they were in serious trouble, the fire was only about 200 yards away and gaining fast. So the men finally found themselves in a race with the fire up the steep canyon wall, and the fire was winning. Wag Dodge looks over his shoulder, sees they're not going to make the ridge in time, and then does something incredible. On an inspiration, he lit fire to the grass in front of him and stepped into the burned out area in hopes that the main fire would then jump over him. It was the very first use of an escape fire. He then called to his men to come join him, but the men, again, couldn't understand that things had changed, couldn't see what he saw. In fact, they thought he'd gone crazy, because here they had way more fire than they could handle behind them, and he was putting fire in front of them. So they cursed him, and they kept running for the ridge. 30 seconds later, all but 3 of them, Wag Dodge and 2 others, would be engulfed by the flames. The men who died that day couldn't see that the game had changed. They couldn't see that they needed to drop their now useless tools, and they couldn't see that they needed to stop running from the main fire and instead step into the escape fire. I teach personal finance to these guys. 3 guesses on who the class clown is. When I say I teach personal finance, I should be a little more specific. I get to teach the fun stuff. In my section, we look at the psychology of money. And by the time my kids leave my class, pretty much everything they know to be true about money, debt, wealth, and how we make decisions will be challenged. I have very little time to make a positive, lasting impression. My whole unit is all of 3 weeks. And Socionomics gets 2 classes. That's about 90 minutes. My whole goal is to get a thumbs up from my students for Socionomics. And I have so little time that I've had to get really creative about simplifying things and making it easy for them to digest. I look at it as it's Socionomics on a speed date. Socionomics speed date style. My goal is to get a second date for Socionomics outside my classroom. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I do that today. And I think about 20 years of teaching and coaching, probably one of the most important things that I've learned is that if I'm going to get the most out of my students and athletes, I have to first connect with them on an emotional level. They have to trust me. They have to see me as somebody who is worth listening to. Social researcher Brené Brown says that connection is why we are here. It is what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. We are hardwired to connect. We all know this. And that connection is an emotional connection. So obviously, and I believe in double-edged swords. You know, we have extreme social mood, which can be very negative, but there's also the positive side of emotion, and that's what I'm going to use in my classroom, because I've learned that I know facts are important, and data is important, but so is emotional intelligence. And I'm going to use emotions to get the most out of facts and data for my kids in the shortest amount of time. Emotions make facts memorable, they make them meaningful, and they make them palatable. I tell my kids, it's like fried dead bird versus finger licking good. You're eating fried dead bird. That's a fact. But that's not what you're thinking, and that's not what you're feeling. A couple months ago, I was fortunate enough to receive a galley copy or a galley proof, of Matt Kohut and John Neffinger's book called Compelling People. They're two guys out of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And in their book, they talk about this concept of a circle. And we all have these circles. These circles represent our worldviews, be it on politics or finance or human behavior or even things like your taste in music. We want people in our circle who feel the same way we do. We trust them. They're our tribe. We have common sense. They are out of touch or ignorant or worse. When we meet new people, they start outside our circle until we can figure out whether or not we want them in it. My job as a teacher is to earn my way inside that circle so that I can connect with them. And more importantly, really what it's all about in those two classes is connecting socionomics with them. And I've learned the hard way that if I don't connect first, they don't hear me. Because the circle not only represents our worldviews, it represents our range of hearing. Does anybody remember what the teacher or the adults sound like in Charlie Brown? Yeah. If I come at my students on the first day and say, here's the facts, here's the data, I'm right, listen to me, they never hear me. But if I can earn their trust, make a connection, I can get into their circle, I can bring them the same facts and same data, and they're far more likely to be receptive to it. So, you know, that's kind of what this is all leading up to how I connect with my students, how I get inside their circle, how I get socionomics inside their circle. The first thing is stories. Like I said, I tell them the story of Man Gulch, and we do many case studies in my class and all kinds of fun stories. Stories are a fantastic way to bring new ideas to people, even potentially controversial ideas, in a very non-threatening way that connects us on an emotional level. Leading communications consultant Seth Pendleton says that a good story is like the Trojan horse from my point of view. We are hardwired for stories. As children, we love fairy tales. Religions use parables. Philosophers use allegories, even in the realm of academia and thought. What brings to life a complex idea better than a case study? A case study is a story. It's a true story, which is even better, but it's a story. Stories connect the dots, they connect our emotions with our intellect, and they connect the storyteller with the audience. If you want someone to remember something, tell them a story. The next thing I do is I simplify and translate everything. I call it my no secret handshakes policy. This is where I'm doing things a little bit differently than all the presenters today. You're going deeper and deeper, which is so great. I have to get easier and easier. I want to make it easy for my students to say yes. And there is no quicker way for me to get kicked out of my student circle than if I speak above them. They're either going to see me as arrogant, or they're going to see me as somebody who doesn't understand their needs. Because nobody likes to feel confused. Nobody likes to feel stupid. And if I use words that they don't understand, that's what I'm setting them up for, and they will kick me out. Now, language is really important. I mean, most of you are in the finance industry. I'm not saying that language isn't important, but what I'm saying is that's a second date or a third date kind of proposition. I want to make them, I kind of look at it as like, what hill do I want to die on? I want them to understand concepts. So since I only have 90 minutes or 2 classes, I need to get the most out of that and make it easier for them so that they're not sitting there trying to play catch up with words. So I'll give you a quick example. This is a financial example, but this year, I've taught this class now 12 times. And this year, I just learned something new because I asked 24 students, what does it mean to carry a balance on your credit card? Out of 24 students, one knew. But as soon as I said, oh, I'm sorry, it means you don't pay your credit card off every month. Oh, Mrs. Boyesen, okay, we get that. It wasn't the concept. It was that tiny little language barrier. So I really have learned to be really vigilant about that. So here's some quick examples, and you're going to recognize a lot of what I do, what I put up here, because thankfully the Socionomics Institute simplifies a lot of their stuff, and I poach 95% of what I do. 5% is original thought, so you'll recognize some of these. But I take it even to the next level. As for my last example, I'm taking any kind of complex word and trying to simplify that. So the first word that I translate is endogenous. It's a great word, but I like instinctual and subconscious because they understand that. I never use the word endogenous in my class. Again, that's a second or third date word. The next example would be to maximize utility. And we heard Bob talking about that today. Again, really important for you all to understand that, but it's just going to bog things down for us. So we don't talk about maximizing utility, but we do talk about wanting to get the biggest bang for your buck. The next example is optimism versus pessimism. They get those words, they understand them, but they're a little bit dry and boring. And I was watching History's Hidden Engine a couple years ago, and I heard Bob talk about, use the words frisky versus fearful. And I just thought, oh, I like that. That's kind of fun. So I brought it into my classroom, and guess what? Every time I use the word frisky, they smile and laugh. They just think it's funny. And I noticed even Bob was doing an interview with, I don't remember who it was a woman, and he used that word, and she went, ooh, I like that word. Like, okay, I'm onto something. And it's a really small example, but you know, small things add up to big things. And if I can make my class more enjoyable and light and fun, and we can do great activities, they're far more likely to retain the information and to be excited to come to class. The next example is what I call slapping a bumper sticker on their brain. And this is a way of taking kind of a heady concept and boiling it down into a bumper sticker. And you know, bumper stickers aren't perfect. They never say it all, they never will. But my hope is that I can hit them with a bumper sticker that will help them remember the bigger concept. And we talk about those bigger concepts in class. We absolutely do. But you know what? I'm lucky if my students get 1 or 2 takeaways from my class. And they're probably not going to get, you know, a headier concept than if I can boil it down into something simple for them. So my first example would be that, you know, we'll talk about the concept that about during times of uncertainty, the limbic system drowns out the neocortex. Therefore, intense emotions can drown out, or do drown out, rational thought. It's really important for them to get that. I don't think they're going to remember that 3 years from now, unless they happen to date socionomics on the outside and fall in love. So that would become, when emotions go up, intelligence goes down. Very simple, very digestible, but still true to the original concept. Another example would be, and this is a core tenet of socionomic thought, that markets don't drive social mood. Social mood drives markets. Social mood drives everything, but in this case, we're talking about the markets. Really, really, if they only learn one thing from my socionomics unit, I want them to learn that it's social mood driving things. So we'll talk about this concept, and then I'll put this up on the board. In other words, markets don't get depressed. People get depressed. And that's very intuitive. It brings it down to a very human level, of course. It's all from humans. Markets are inanimate. Economies are inanimate. It starts with humans. And this also isn't perfect because it doesn't address how markets don't get manic. People get manic. But I put that up on the board too, and we have a really good discussion as why that's not as intuitive. So even imperfect things can spur really fun discussions. The next thing I want to do is I want to make socionomics meaningful to my students. And I want to hit them where they live and breathe. This is where it gets fun. Because I can go out and research and find stuff and bring it into my classroom and customize socionomics for my kids. And I was having lunch with Peter Atwater about 6 months ago. He's here today, and he spoke here last year. And he told me that he had charted William and Mary's building projects to the Dow. And I thought, oh, that's a cool idea. I like that. So I poached that, went back, dug around in our archives. And I was really nervous to do this because, I'm not a researcher. I'm relatively new to this. I was sitting there, oh, please be okay, because I thought once I started, I kind of had an ethical responsibility to put up the end product. So I charted the start dates and the finish dates. Actually, I just show you the groundbreaking dates on this chart. And it's not the greatest, but you'll see that every single building on our campus was built right at or very near a market peak, and followed by a recession or depression represented by the red dots. Every single one. There was the one that was almost at a peak, that broke ground in 1928, as opposed to 1929. Every other building was pretty much spot on. And this is a way of making it, so, they are literally sitting in a building that Social Mood built. And if they get bored in my class, they can look out the window and see 10 other buildings that Social Mood built. And we had a really fun discussion on this because we had a huge building, just extravaganza on our campus in 2007. And the school went into $100 million worth of debt for the first time ever. We went into debt to the tune of $100 million and just built like crazy. And then, boom, Social Mood decline. And you would have thought World War III broke out on our campus. And they remembered that. And they remembered their parents being all upset. And so it was just so much fun to see them really start engaging and talking about it. And it was because I took the time to make it meaningful to them. You could borrow a lot of my stuff, but if you really want to hit them in the emotions, customize it for them. Some successes that I've had. I don't have a whole lot of time today to talk about successes or failures, which is kind of convenient, but feel free to ask me about them. I actually don't mind failures. It's no fun to go through them, but I actually have a philosophy, I'm sure many of you do, that we learn far more about ourselves when we're failing than when we're succeeding. So failures are a good thing. The two successes that I wanted to talk about today are actually in this room with us today, and they are pictured on your, let's see, it would be on your left, the redhead. Can I do that? Is that sexist? The redhead is Ben Adams, and on the other side is Tyler Hill, and I'd like you guys to please stand up for me. These guys, yay. You can stay standing up so I can embarrass you a little bit more. Because this is the last chance I get to do this. They're not in my class anymore. These guys won the academic awards for personal finance last year. And they are outstanding young men. They're not only very bright and very hardworking, but they're interested in socionomics. So please do me a favor and introduce yourselves to these guys. And they're not only great academic examples of fine high school students, but they're also just really, really great people. So please introduce yourselves to them, and you guys can sit down now. So I wanted to say that you'll notice that they're holding copies of Conquer the Crash. And last year, Bob was kind enough to sign copies, autograph those copies, and send them up to the boys as a gift for winning the academic award in my class. And I wanted to say, I don't think there's any such thing as a small connection. And I think that small connections can often mean far more because the person didn't have to do that. It could have been very easy for him to say no, but he did it. And I know it was meaningful to those boys. So I don't think it's any coincidence that they came down here today. Yes, we had an excellent working rapport in the classroom, and they're very interested in socionomics, but I know that that meant something to them. And then as soon as the Socionomics Institute found out that they were coming down, they went out of their way to make them feel welcome. And I think that's a very powerful thing, because that's my experience is having worked with the Socionomics Institute a little bit in improving my class this year. I have been really impressed by not only how bright they are, but how warm they are and how much they just really, want people to enjoy socionomics, and they're very emotionally intelligent. And I think that that's an incredibly powerful combination. I think it bodes well for the future of socionomics. The moral of the story. Wag Dodge died in 1955 of Hodgkin's disease. It wasn't related to the fire. And years later, Norman MacLean went back and interviewed his wife and a bunch of people. And by all accounts, Wag Dodge was a really hard worker. He was very skilled, very dedicated. But something really jumped out at me when I was researching all this. He was incredibly emotionally reserved. He was the definition of stoic. He preferred emotional distance in all of his relationships. His own wife was quoted as saying, "I loved him very much, but I didn't know him very well." He never got to know his men. In fact, he didn't even know some of their names. All his men knew about him pretty much was his name. So from a psychological perspective, it's no surprise to me that when the final orders came to drop their equipment, run for the ridge, and to finally step into the escape fire, they couldn't hear him. He had no emotional connection with them whatsoever. Socionomics lays out in beautiful pictures and stories how we are all incredibly intertwined with one another on an emotional level. Like Dodge's escape fire, it offers a safe haven for those who follow it. But also like Dodge's escape fire, it's counterintuitive. It's a big step for a lot of people to take. It's a paradigm shift. Our goal is to grow the circle of socionomics. The next time you have a chance to talk to somebody who's new to socionomics, especially those who are not in the financial industries, consider the lessons of Man Gulch. Connect with them first. Before you bring them all the data and facts, connect with them first. It does not have to be a big connection. Just being warm and open and friendly goes a long way. If you happen to know a story that might be relevant, tell the story. Make it meaningful to them. Find out what they're interested in. Above all, simplify and translate. Make it easy for them to say yes. Once you earn your way inside that circle, you have a much better chance of bringing them those same facts and that same data and slowly leading them into the growing circle of socionomics. Thank you very much.
Great presentation. I have a
Thank you.
question. How do your students make connections with socionomics? What do they share with you about how it's relevant to them?
Oh, great question. Well, okay, I guess this is where I can start talking about some failures too, but I don't look at it as a failure though. I think socionomics is a huge paradigm shift to start that off. About 80% of my students say, that is really cool, I'm not sure I buy it. About 15% say, oh my gosh, this is great. I had a bunch of students this year say it was their favorite part of the class, which that was so exciting because it's my favorite part of the class too. And we have a lot of fun in my class. I mean, it's a fun class, but they really enjoyed that, so that was exciting. So connecting that, I would say those are the successes. I've had about 5% say, no way. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but.
Is it through music or movies?
Oh, I see. Yeah, oh gosh, no, that, you just brought up my failures actually. Thanks very much. Is he a plant? I was going to bring this into my presentation, but I didn't have time because it really irritates the heck out of me. I have tried doing movies and music with them. And I put it in my class, and then I took it out, and then, I tried to put it back in again, and I always get pushed back on movies and music. And it very well could be, I'm just not teaching it well. Part of me wonders if, the adolescent brain is just trying on their critical thinking caps. And there seems to be a tendency they really appreciate black and white things. And I think movies and music can introduce some gray area when you don't have the time to address it properly. Like doing it on a speed date is tough. But it's so frustrating because what's more meaningful to teens than movies and music? So I'd actually love to sit down with someone at the Socionomics Institute and try to figure out how I can do this quickly and in a meaningful way. So.
Question for you,
Yeah.
ma'am. A lot of people, especially of my generation and older, will tend to criticize social media. They'll cite a table full of young folks sitting at a restaurant table just texting, okay?
Oh, yeah.
No conversation, all texting at table. And saying that this is a perfect example of how social media is extinguishing connections and extinguishing personal relationships. You, on the other hand, are very much about building relationships.
Right.
Is social media a good thing? Is Twittering and texting? All that one might say from a teacher's perspective who's very plugged into, a gentleman like this, and I might be interested in their opinion as well.
I think you brought up another double-edged sword. I see it as it's shifting and changing, and there's really good aspects of it, and there's not so good aspects of it. But yeah, so that's a tough one. I mean, I guess I look at my son who loves to video game, and there's a lot of criticism about video games. But my thought is, he's actually incredibly social because he does it in groups. So that's how he bonds. That's like guy bonding time. And so I've kind of learned to try to step back a little and respect changes in culture. And I think like anything else, there's good and bad. But yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer it, but great question.
Here's one you're qualified to answer for certain. And this has to be from a guy in the market. Is there a current building project on campus now?
Oh. No, there's not.
Any in plan?
What's that?
Are there any planned?
Well, in a funny way, there's like one donor who wants a lot of stuff built, but the college is saying, the college and the high school, the college is associated with the high school, they're saying no, not right now. So we do have a few individual donors who are, come on, we got to do this, but no, the schools don't want anything to do with it.
Thank you very much,
Yep.
Marah.